warm plains, the fields of grain stretch as far as the eye can reach. Corn, oats, hops, rye, and don't forget wheat, 1/3 of the world's best. Yes, Russia is very rich, for it has not only raw materials and the products of its soil. Russia is also people. 193 million people. People of every race, color, and creed. People coming from the many different republics that comprised the Soviet Union. People speaking more than 100 different languages, but all citizens of one country. Whether they are the great Russians, the descendants of the first settlers of this vast area, and for 1,000 years its main population, or Cossacks, the famous horsemen from the open plains of the Don River Valley. Whether they come from the Southwest, the Ukraine, here in the breadbasket of the Soviet Union live the Little Russians, better known as Ukrainians, and beside them the Moldavians and Bessarabians. Or if they come from the far south, between the Caspian and Black Seas, where we find the Armenians and the Georgians, the Ingush, the Cherkess, rugged as the high peaks of their native Caucasian mountains. Whether they are Uzbeks, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, from the Persian and Indian frontiers, or Mongols, the Bashkirs, the Turco-Tartars, the Buryats, the Yakuts, from far beyond the Ural Mountains, or the people of the ice country, hunters like the Zounds, or settlers like the Laplanders. Whether they come from the pioneering wilderness of the far north, or from a great city like their capital, Moscow, where the ancient buildings of an ancient civilization stand beside the modern structures of a modern civilization, where the old Russian droshka still competes with the modern limousine. Whether they work in factories or as soldiers, whether they are bricklayers or traffic cops, sailors or riveters, school children or farmers, nurses or engineers, window washers or salesgirls, housewives or postal clerks, radio announcers or stewardesses, scientists or typists, musicians or ballerinas. Regardless of what they do or where they live, they all have one thing in common: love of their soil. That is Russia. Size, the largest country in the world. Raw materials, unlimited. Manpower, 193 million. These are the three reasons why every conqueror in history has wanted Russia. And these are the reasons why the modern would-be conqueror wrote,
"When we speak of new territory, we must think of Russia. Destiny itself points the way there."
Hitler's Germany, the dream was world conquest. To such a dream, there could be only one answer: collective security. So with this objective, in 1934, the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations, to attack.
The state I represent entered the League with the sole purpose of the maintenance of indivisible peace. The League of Nations is still strong enough by its collective actions to avert or arrest aggression. There is no room for bargaining or compromise.
But whilst of collective force to stop aggression, the world saw other members, Germany, Italy, Japan, withdraw from the League to follow the path of aggression. Then Hitler invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, and in 1939, Poland. To such a dream, there could be only one answer: collective security. So with this objective, in 1934, the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations. Again and again before the League, its representatives urged binding agreements to support by collective action any nation submitted to attack.
The state I represent entered the League with the sole purpose of the maintenance of indivisible peace. The League of Nations is still strong enough by its collective actions to avert or arrest aggression. There is no room for bargaining or compromise.
But while some members of the League were pleading vainly for the use of collective force to stop aggression, the world saw other members, Germany, Italy, Japan, withdraw from the League to follow the path of aggression. Manchuria, Ethiopia. Then Hitler invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, and in 1939, Poland. First step on the road to Russia. But his eastward march was interrupted by France and Britain declaring war. So the Germans... And on July 17th, they captured the first main objective, Smolensk, regarded as the key to Moscow. Simultaneously, in the south, von Rundstedt's forces cut deep into the Ukraine. This was blitzkrieg at its best. The world gave Russia another 6 weeks, and the Germans issued a communique.
The issue in the east has already been settled. Smolensk is the last halt on the road to Moscow.
But then a strange thing happened. For the first time since the mighty German army started its career of blitz, smashing into submission one European country after the other, that same German army came up against a country that did not submit. Despite the fact that Hitler's army swept deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union, and by October the 15th stood practically within the shadows of the Kremlin, despite the fact that the Soviet government and all foreign missions were forced to move to Kuibyshev, 700 miles to the east, despite Hitler's triumphant pronouncement, "I can say that this enemy is already broken and will never rise again," despite the fact that by December, 500,000 square miles of Russian territory, an area equal to the entire Middle Western United States, had fallen to the invaders. Yes, despite Russia's loss of her best agricultural areas, her most thoroughly developed industrial plants, millions of her people, thousands of her tanks and her planes, despite everything, those 6 weeks had lengthened into nearly 6 months, and the dread Nazi blitz had spluttered, stumbled, and finally died.
The Russians stopped Hitler at the very gates of Moscow. And how, in spite of Hitler's prediction that by December of 1941, the swastika would fly over the Kremlin towers. December had come, but it wasn't the swastika that flew over the Russian capital, and it wasn't the Nazi conquerors who marched through the streets of the ancient city, but fresh reserves of the Red Army on their way to reinforce and relieve the front lines.
The Russians read this appeal and knew what it meant. They remembered that in their past history, the time always came when they could turn and strike back. The time had come. Their old ally, the Russian winter, had carpeted the Russian land. And while in the churches of Russia, men of God prayed for victory against the invader, finally, the morning comes, and the people of Leningrad dig themselves out from the ruins. They seem very similar here to the people of London, of Rotterdam, of Warsaw. As in those cities, there were ruined homes, museums, and other important military objectives, like the Russian Dumbo from the Leningrad Zoo. But there was one important difference. Bombing from the air was only one small part of what the people of Leningrad had to face. In September, the Nazis surrounded the city and announced it was cut off and doomed. The German commander sent the city an ultimatum demanding its surrender. He is still waiting for the answer. Thus began the siege of Leningrad, a siege that was to last for nearly 17 months. In Leningrad, as everywhere else in Russia, the winter came early that year. A cold, hard winter, the hardest in years. But here, unlike everywhere else in Russia, the winter wasn't an ally, but an enemy. Here, the 10, 20, 30 below zero temperatures could only mean more suffering, more hardship. In the trenches outside the city, this city had become the focal point of the whole campaign. Regardless of the cost, Stalingrad must be captured. Those were the German orders. Fire! Fire! German guns, German bombs shattered the city into pieces. By September 20th, the Germans, after 30 days of grueling and ceaseless fighting, battled their way into the city's outskirts. By the end of the month, their drive had carried them through the whole northwest section of the city and into occupation of part of the center, including the railroad station. On the last day of September, Hitler announced that the fall of the city was only a matter of a few days. Once more, the world was afraid a Russian campaign was lost. But once more, the Germans were to stand on the very threshold of victory and still fail. For now they were to meet a fire of fury such as they had never known. All that had gone before, The battles waged in the streets of Kiev, Rostov, Odessa, Sevastopol, these were all preludes to what happened in Stalingrad. The world spoke in admiration of the city of steel. The ticker tape brought us breathtaking news. American and British troops had landed in and occupied North Africa. Further east, the British Eighth Army was driving westward, pursuing the vaunted Africa Corps. And in the northeast, the Red Army had launched its smashing counteroffensive. The Germans were learning the real meaning of the words combined operations. As though a spring had been released, Russians attacked along the entire front. In the far north, the Germans felt the first impact as the Russians recaptured Schlüsselburg, breaking the Axis ring around Leningrad. Soon after, another offensive lashed out further south, bypassing the Germans' defense position at Rzhev and plunging down to Veliki Luki. Still another Russian blow fell in the Voronezh area, pushing a threatening spearhead deep into the German lines. In the far south, the Germans were moving away from Grozny instead of toward it, under the force of the Russian attack. At Stalingrad, the Germans were about to meet new opponents. Fresh reserves were arriving from far Siberia. They had been stationed there in case of trouble with the Japanese. Now these troops had been transported to relieve the embattled defenders of Stalingrad. And as the reserves entered the city, at headquarters, the commanders of 3 Russian armies were meeting. The Germans had fought for Stalingrad as a prize. The Russians were determined to make it a trap. 2 simultaneous attacks were launched, one from the north, one from the south. These battle-hardened soldiers of the Northern Army and soldiers of the Southern were emotional as children as they greeted each other. They knew this meeting meant the salvation of Stalingrad and of their country. And on this Christmas of 1942, the people of the Soviet Union can celebrate with happy hearts. They have received a most precious gift from the men of their army, the assurance of ultimate victory. Just as in our hometowns, it is the Children's Day in Moscow. It is a happier Christmas this year. Today, there are no German bombers overhead. In other years, the Russians, like ourselves, celebrated on New Year's Eve, but not now. The factories are just as busy as on any other night. The moment comes. It is the new year.
С Новым годом!
And at the front, the greeting is the same, up to a point.
С Новым годом, гвардейцы! Огонь!
See to it that their families died in reprisal. When he faced his captors, perhaps his worried expression reflected an anxiety that Hitler might take the same revenge on his family. For he knew that when he surrendered, Hitler lost not only a field marshal, he lost an entire army, 22 divisions, 330,000 men. These are the men who had been promised that as conquerors they would winter in Stalingrad. Well, it was winter, and this was Stalingrad, and here were the conquerors. 185,000 square miles of Russian land had been freed. And in this winter campaign of 1942, the Axis powers had lost 5,090 planes, 9,190 tanks, 20,360 guns, 30,705 machine guns, more than 500,000 rifles, 17 million shells, 128 million cartridges, vast stores of other materials, and 1,193,525 men, of whom 800,000 were dead. That is the story to date of the German attempt to conquer Russia. In 1941, they tried for Moscow and failed. In 1942, they tried for the Caucasus and failed. In 1943, and for as many more years as necessary, they will not only be resisted wherever their failing power strikes, but they will be attacked, and attacked by these united people of these united nations.